I've been thinking about the challenges and opportunities that come with large worship spaces and smaller worship spaces. Especially given we're in our Kesher Shabbat today. Sometimes we're in our very large sanctuary that holds 1,200 people. Each of them, I think, have their benefits and maybe also some drawbacks. And as we've been in this space, we've had some weeks where we've been asking ourselves this question, oh my gosh, like, what do we do if we run out of seats? We've got this new lounge area over there for the school-age kids. Also, there's some sound infiltration from there. How do we honor the kids and also not have it be sort of a screaming at the top of your lungs space? And, you know, like, what does it mean to kind of be in large spaces and small spaces, and what does all that mean for us? And we do have a tradition within Judaism of this kind of idea of the mikdash, the temple, and before that, the tabernacle, this mikdash gadol, this large worship space, and also this idea of a mikdash ma'at, of a smaller worship space, a smaller place to encounter the divine through and among our fellow Jews and human beings. So the mikdash ma'at then is perhaps the synagogue, and the rabbis talk about it in that way. But also we talk about the table as a form of altar, and Passover is coming, and the home is another form of mikdash ma'at, a small space. And so on that note, I want to dedicate our learning today to Karin Batterton. May her memory be for a blessing. Because she sold us our home. And this home that we've lived in for almost 14 years. And if you knew Karin, and I know a lot of you knew Karin, and some of you may have sold your homes with Karin or bought your homes from Karin, or just know her from shul, the gift of a home, of a small space to come together and do sacred things and ordinary things is really something extraordinary, and I am feeling her loss very much this week. So you have a source sheet in front of you, and I'm going to try to move us, it's a lot of text, so I'm going to try to move it through it fairly quickly. The first part actually comes from this week's Parashat, from Pekudei, and it starts with this central place of worship. These are the records of the tabernacle, Ela Pekudei. The tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar ben Aaron, the priest, all the gold that was used for the work, and all the work of the sanctuary, the elevation offering of gold, came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight. The silver of those of the community that were recorded came to 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by the sanctuary weight, a half shekel a head, half a shekel by the sanctuary weight, for each of one who was entered into the records from the age of 20 years and up, 603,550 men. So we have not only an accounting of the space that's then being constructed by the people, but also the grandeur of the space, right? This is made with precious metals, and the priestly garments are with the best possible fabrics, and precious gems are arrayed in this beautiful breastplate. The tabernacle is a place of beauty. It's special. It's an investment by the community. And that number, 603,550, is a kind of magic number in our tradition. One, there's a tradition that says that that's exactly the numbers of letters in the Torah, so one for every person who's counted. If you ever count the letters in the Torah, it's not this, but you know, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? And of course, that kind of general number, 600,000, is what we think of as like the totality of the Jewish people, leaving aside that this was just men of fighting age, but it becomes sort of a stand-in for like all of us together, all of us together. In fact, there's a special bracha that we say if ever there are 600,000 Jews in one place. Has anyone ever done that? I've never had the privilege of being in a place where there's 600,000 Jews together. Does anyone know what the bracha is? Yeah, Chacham Harazim. Blessed are you, God, the knower of secrets. So I'll sort of leave it to you to think about, like, what does that actually mean? Why that blessing when you're all together? But it is very special, of course, to have all of the Jewish people together. Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about something related to that in just a little bit. But now I want to move us to the Haftarah that we would not have read even if it were a regular Shabbat Pekudei today, because this is actually the Haftarah for the Sephardi reading for Vayakel for last week. But suffice it to say that Vayakel Pekudei, they have these special Haftarot. There are 3 different options, and all of them come more or less from Malachim Aleph, from 1 Kings chapters 7 and 8. And so I want you to sort of hear, we didn't get to do this today, but you get a sense of the extension of the experience of the tabernacle into Beit HaMikdash, the temple, which is then completed in Jerusalem. And if the tabernacle was impressive, both in its kind of scale for a people wandering through the wilderness, and in terms of the precious materials that are brought together to create it, ala chat kama v'chama, all the more so when it comes to Beit HaMikdash, to the temple. So here's just a sampling of that. He made the columns so that they were 2 rows of pomegranates encircling the top of one network to cover the capitals that were on top of the pomegranates. And he did the same for the network on the second capital. The capitals upon the columns of the portico were a lily design, 4 cubits high. So also the capitals upon the 2 columns extended above and next to the bulge that was set beside the network. There were 200 pomegranates in rows around the top of the second capital. He set up the columns at the portico of the great hall. He set up one column on the right and named it Yachin. You should always give a nice name to your columns. And he set up the other column on the left, and he named it Boaz. Upon the top of the columns, there was a lily design. Thus, the work of the columns was completed. By the way, I was talking about Vayechal, like the Hebrew before, about completing of the tabernacle, same Hebrew word. Then he made the tank of cast metal. Okay? Now, I want you to kind of try to take this in for a moment. The tank, whatever this is, 10 cubits. What's a cubit? It's like this. It's an amma, a cubit, is like here to here, so a little more than a foot. From brim to brim, completely round, it was 5 cubits high. It measured 30 cubits in circumference. Think about the size of that. There were gourds below the brim, completely encircling it, 10 to a cubit, encircling the tank. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast in one piece with it. It stood upon 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, 3 facing east, with a tank resting upon them. Their haunches were all turned inward. So these are these kind of brazen oxen, bronze oxen. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was made like that of a cup, like the petals of a lily. Its capacity was 2,000 baths. A bath, I looked it up. Bet taf is a technical term. It's a measurement, approximately 8 gallons in one bath. So just kind of imagine the size of this thing. I also looked up the word bath and thought, oh, I didn't know that bath comes from the Hebrew. But I couldn't find actually anyone who made the claim etymologically that it comes from the Hebrew. They said it comes from other places. So I'm not sure. It seems weird. But anyway, here it is. And if you want a sense of what this might have looked like, here is a rendering on the next page. Okay? Look at the little people down there. Right? This is this enormous, enormous bath that seems to have existed in Solomon's temple. Okay? And if you want a sense of like, wow, how beautiful, how grand, how majestic was this building, you look at a Baraita maybe in the Gemara, in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Sukkah, which says if you think the temple in Jerusalem built by King Solomon was nice, you should really see the temple built by King Herod. The Gemara says that our sages taught Tanu Rabbanan, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, never saw celebration in his life. One who did not see Jerusalem in its glory, never saw a beautiful city. And one who did not see the temple in its constructed state, never saw a magnificent structure. And then the question that's asked, what temple are we referring to? Of course, there were 2. Abaye said, and some say it was Rav Chisda, this is referring to the temple of Herod, the second temple. Even more majestic than the first temple, which already, as you saw, was pretty impressive. And so you would think that the ultimate big worship space, this Mikdash Gadol, must be Beit HaMikdash, must be the temple in Jerusalem. And then we get kind of a weird thing. So here's the Pekudei de Rabbi Eliezer, a midrashic collection. Here they're talking about Jonah. The Lord, a really beautiful midrash in its own right, talking about Jonah. The Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Rabbi Tarfon said that fish was specially appointed from the 6 days of creation to swallow up Jonah. As it is said, the Lord had prepared a great fish, right, in the, I don't know, the pluperfect? I don't know what the is that right? Did I get it? Okay, good. So to swallow up Jonah, he entered its mouth just as a man enters the great synagogue. And he stood therein. The two eyes of the fish were like windows of glass giving light to Jonah. And now we have like an interesting footnote here from Rabbi Gerald Friedlander, rabbi in London in the early 20th century, who's speculating about this. What are we talking about, this great synagogue that the Midrash is referring to? We know about the temple. It was pretty great. We've heard that. But a great synagogue? Does the great synagogue refer to the famous synagogue of Alexandria? What? What great synagogue of Alexandria? Well, in fact, there was a great synagogue in Alexandria of the expatriate Jewish community there in Egypt, and that is described in Masechet Sukkah. It says further on after that description that we had just a little bit earlier, where I brought the Baraita, where they said no one has ever seen beauty or grandeur if you haven't experienced the temple, and then we have this really kind of subversive text that says, wait a second, it is taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda says, one who did not see the great synagogue, and they even use the Greek here, Dea Phlaston, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, of Alexandria of Egypt, never saw the glory of Israel. They said, just to give you a sense of this, that its structure was like a large basilica with a colonnade within a colonnade, right? Like a marketplace within a marketplace. Imagine the size of this, the scope of this. At times there were, remember that number I told you before? 600,000 men and another 600,000 men within it, twice the number of those who left Egypt. In it there were 71 golden chairs, corresponding to the 71 members of the great Sanhedrin. Right? Obviously, the intention here is to say this space is just like that space, because there was a space for the Sanhedrin in the temple, but maybe even better, even grander, even bigger. Each of which consisted of no less than 21,000 talents of gold. How many talents of gold were there in the Mishkan? 29. Okay? Not bad, but not this. 21,000 talents of gold, and there was a wooden platform at the center, and the sexton of the synagogue, right? Like the shamus, the caretaker, maybe they say chazan is the word here, but a chazan didn't quite mean what it means today. But there was this guy whose job it was to stand on the bima, it seems, with scarves in his hand, because this place was so large that you couldn't necessarily hear the davening from the back of the room, okay? And when they would come to, when the prayer leader reached the conclusion of a blessing, the sexton would raise these flags or these scarves, and all the people knew that that was their cue to respond, Amen, Amen. Okay. So we have kind of the ultimate in majesty. I will share with you, there's a bit of a sad end to the story, which maybe is a sermon for another time, but the Gemara goes on to say that the great synagogue of Alexandria was destroyed by Alexander the Great, and it was destroyed because Jews were not supposed to move back to Egypt. And so in the classic tradition of Jewish self-flagellation, we blame ourselves for our own destruction, and had they not moved to Egypt, then they wouldn't have been destroyed, and that was the great sin. Maybe there were some other things going on that the text is implying about how people are situated within. You should just know that there's a parallel text in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem or the Palestinian Talmud, that comes from the land of Israel from about 100 to to 200 years before the Babylonian Talmud, and that is actually more historically accurate. It wouldn't have been Alexander the Great who destroyed that community or that synagogue in the 4th century before the Common Era. It was actually probably it was Trajan in the year 115 of the Common Era who did this, and there was a great destruction of the Jewish community of Alexandria, and there seems to have been, and this is corroborated by other sources, a destruction of this great synagogue, whatever it looked like, even if it didn't have quite enough space to hold 600,000 plus 600,000 people within it. It seems to have been a real thing and quite amazing, and it was destroyed by the Romans as a way of sort of, well, maybe it was a pogrom, maybe it was a revolt. It's not entirely clear, but the community was destroyed, and it was quite catastrophic. But I bring this to you because what the Gemara is doing here, I think, is trying to give us a sense of, like, what does it mean to recreate something that could have been as special as the temple in Jerusalem, the first one or the second one. Which brings me to a question for us of, like, what is sacred worship space? When we're upstairs, I don't know about you, but that is one of the most beautiful sanctuaries I've ever been in. There's something about it that's like understated and exquisite, and it doesn't have like unga pacha stained glass like you have in some places, and no shade on that stained glass, but it just like everything has kind of clean lines, and it's easy to feel at peace there. On the other hand, it's a really big room, and when we're up there with a small group of people, it's not maybe impossible to hear the prayer and to say Amen, but it's a little challenging. And it's a little hard to actually stand on the bima and look out and hear people. We can't actually hear the singing so well. We can see our mouths moving, but the sound doesn't bring the sound so much toward the bima, right? One of the reasons that I love this space, and I love the old chapel that we used to have, is that it does give us an opportunity to hear each other, see each other more clearly, look into each other's eyes, respond to Amen. There's an intimacy also to a smaller space. And you can understand why the rabbis felt that a synagogue should also be a mikdash me'at. It should be a smaller space. It doesn't need to compete necessarily with Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem. And I want to share with you, kind of by way of conclusion here, a text that Miriam brought back to me. Where's Miriam? I thought I saw her come in. Maybe she's in another room. Brought in, she was just at a gathering in Chicago of the CCER, of the Umbrella Organization for Reform Rabbis. The Reform movement is developing a new Chumash, and I didn't put the text on here because it's actually an unproofed text and it's not to be distributed yet, so I'm going to read it to you, but I couldn't put it in print. But I thought this was really beautiful. They were looking through some of this commentary. This is from Susie Colliver, who's an architect and who designs sanctuary and chapel spaces. So this is her reflection on sacred space. For those who sense their first glimmer of the divine under a redwood tree or by the side of a lake at Jewish summer camp, the American synagogues built within the first 70 years of the 20th century often seem to lack a spiritual component. Those built before World War II tended to be urban with straight rows of seats facing forward, a hierarchical arrangement of spaces, and high raised bima. From the exterior, they often appeared fortress-like with few, if any, windows. Happily, that is not the case with our sanctuary. But there are elements there that I think are evocative of ours. Following World War II, synagogue construction burgeoned in the suburbs. Most of these new reform and conservative shuls were practical and efficient, reflecting both the modernist spirit of the era and the limited budgets of young post-war families. While these spaces met the needs and desires of their communities at the time, today's synagogue spaces realize different modes of spirituality and resonate with much of the sacred architecture of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was imagined as a microcosm of creation. Its furnishings reference the sea, the land, the heavens, the creatures that inhabit them. Similarly, the synagogues that speak to today's sensibilities bring the natural world into the holy space, sometimes through natural motifs, at other times through references to the creation story, yet always with carefully captured natural light. the ever-changing quality of light in the sanctuary makes visible the passage of time. Consequently, sanctuaries not only are sacred spaces, but also connect us to the holiness of time through the often surprising placement of apertures in the walls and ceilings. These spaces are suffused with a light that harkens back to God's presence, as a cloud that fills the Mishkan and the pillar of firelight above it that guides the Israelites through the wilderness, allowing us to find the divine within ourselves, the community, and the sacred places in which we choose to worship together. So, again, I stand by our sanctuary being a truly special space, but also, as much as I miss the chapel, one of the things that we were trying to do with this space, you'll see, was within the constraints of our historic building and our capabilities to raise money and other factors, we wanted to be able to bring more light into the space. You'll notice, like, there's a reason we have a glass wall here, and that we have now the southern exposure being able to bring light into the space in a way that we were never able to have before. There's an intimacy, even to this modular space, that thank God we were able to create in order to be a little more close together. This Beit Midrash, right, this place of worship is also fundamentally a place of learning. And one of the things that I really appreciate about being in this space is the ability to pass out a source sheet, to have, when we have more time, a little more interaction sometimes around those source sheets, and to be able to learn Torah in a way that's perhaps a little less frontal and a little more communal. There was a time when sanctuaries were built to reflect a sense of a vertical relationship with God. God was up here, the people were down there. The rabbi and the cantor were out here, the people were down there. One thing we did when we brought the bima out was to signify Beth Am's ethos of experiencing God more between and among us, and not just kind of up there. And we're able to do that by bringing the pews around and making it even more intimate. But there's also this space where we don't need to wave any handkerchiefs to let you know that it's time to move on in the service, which brings me back to that other Mikdash Ma'at. The special maftir that we heard read today talks about the Korban Pesach. And if there's any holiday that best represents what it is to have sacred experiences, not just in synagogue, but also in our home, it's probably Passover. That's why demographers tell us it is the most observed Jewish holiday, right? More than Yom Kippur. Jews, in much higher numbers, even than Yom Kippur, certainly than Shabbat, observe Passover in some form. Why? Because you don't have to come to shul. All you have to do is invite some people over that you love, or go to their house and eat matzah together and read through a book, and maybe you do a long version and maybe you do a shorter version, but the Pesach Seder is the ultimate kind of Mikdash Ma'at worship experience. So that's not a new innovation, that's actually there in the text that we read today, where it says that the Korban Pesach may have been sacrificed in the temple, but it was eaten in smaller spaces where families came together. And if you couldn't afford your own, or you were a small family, you would share one of those lambs, and you would break bread, meaning matzah, together, and you would enjoy the Korban together. That's what we get to do in a couple of weeks when we celebrate Pesach. That's what my family gets to do in our home because of Karin Batterton. And we should all have a joyous, joyous festival this year.